How could a 12-year-old become the prime suspect in the death of his 2-year-old brother? What kind of tragedy unfolds when innocence collides with unimaginable violence? 12 years old, a fragile age when childhood curiosity meets the early struggles of adolescence. 2 years old, a tender time of first words, first steps, and endless potential. Yet, in March 2011, these two worlds collided in a tragedy so shocking it shattered a family and sent shockwaves across the nation. This is the story of Cristian Fernandez, a boy thrust into the darkest spotlight imaginable. Accused of taking the life of his younger brother, David Galarraga, Cristian's name became a lightning rod for debates about justice, accountability, and the failures of a system meant to protect its most vulnerable. In a quiet Jacksonville, Florida apartment complex, the unimaginable unfolded. 2-year-old David was found gravely injured, his tiny body bearing the marks of trauma no child should endure. Standing in the shadows of this devastating scene was his older brother, Cristian, whose actions would soon be at the center of a legal and moral firestorm. Was Cristian a victim? An innocent, shaped by a lifetime of neglect, abuse, and unimaginable loss? Or was he a perpetrator, capable of understanding the weight of his actions despite his age? As investigators delved into the family's haunting past, they unearthed a web of pain and dysfunction that raised more questions than answers. This is not just the story of a crime, it's the story of a child. A story that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about innocence, accountability, and the role of society in shaping both. Cristian Fernandez's life was marked by hardship long before the tragic events of March 2011. Born in 1999, Cristian entered a world filled with chaos and instability. His mother, Bianella Susana, was just 12 years old when she gave birth to him, a child herself struggling to navigate a difficult life. The family's troubles began early, with Cristian often caught in the crossfire of neglect and abuse. His grandmother, who played a significant role in his upbringing, was later accused of failing to provide a safe environment. Cristian's early years were spent moving between relatives and foster homes, never experiencing the stability and safety every child deserves. By the time he was 8 years old, Cristian faced one of the most traumatic events of his young life. His stepfather, a man who had already inflicted pain on the family, ended his own life in their home, a horrific event Cristian witnessed firsthand. This incident was a turning point, adding to the emotional burden he was already carrying. By 2011, Cristian, his mother, and his siblings had settled in a modest apartment in Jacksonville. The family's financial struggles were evident, but it was the emotional turmoil that truly defined their household. Bianella, struggling with her own demons, was unable to provide the support her children needed. Despite these challenges, there were no outward signs of what was to come. On March 14th, paramedics were called to the family's home. 2-year-old David Galarraga was unresponsive. He was rushed to the hospital, but his injuries were too severe to survive. Doctors discovered a skull fracture so severe that it was immediately clear this was no ordinary accident. Authorities began to piece together the events leading up to David's death, and all eyes turned to Cristian. The investigation painted a grim picture. Cristian, just 12 years old, admitted to pushing his brother, a single act of frustration that turned deadly. But as details emerged, the case became more complex. Cristian's past, filled with abuse and neglect, came into focus. How could a child who had endured so much pain himself be responsible for causing such tragedy? March 14th, 2011. A day that began like any other in the Fernandez household would soon spiral into one of the most tragic events Jacksonville, Florida, had ever witnessed. Inside a small apartment, a young boy lay unconscious, his body bearing signs of a brutal injury. By nightfall, 2-year-old David Galarraga would succumb to his wounds, and his 12-year-old brother, Cristian Fernandez, would be thrust into the center of a case that would shock the nation. According to statements gathered later, Cristian Fernandez had been left alone to care for his younger siblings while his mother, Bianella Susana, ran errands. For many families, this would seem unthinkable, but for Cristian, it was routine. He had long been the caregiver, bearing responsibilities far beyond his years. Sometime that afternoon, an argument escalated between Cristian and David. Frustration boiled over, leading Cristian to push his younger brother. David fell, striking his head against the sharp edge of a bookshelf. He cried out, his small voice filled with pain, but Cristian, unaware of the severity of the injury, tried to calm him. Hours passed, and David's condition worsened. By the time their mother returned, it was clear that something was terribly wrong. Instead of calling 911 immediately, Bianella made a series of fateful decisions. She turned to the internet, searching for symptoms and home remedies for head injuries. It wasn't until David lost consciousness that she finally rushed him to the hospital. But the delay proved fatal. Medical staff discovered a catastrophic skull fracture, and it didn't take long for authorities to classify the injury as non-accidental. Law enforcement quickly launched an investigation. Cristian Fernandez was taken into custody and questioned. What emerged during the interrogation was both chilling and heartbreaking. Cristian's words painted a picture of a boy overwhelmed, scared, and confused. As investigators pieced together the events of that day, they began to uncover a more complex story, one that couldn't be explained by a single moment of anger. Born to a mother who herself was just a child at 12 years old, Cristian's life had been marked by unimaginable hardships. His stepfather, a volatile presence in the home, had subjected the family to abuse before ending his own life in front of Cristian, a trauma that would leave deep emotional scars. Interviews with family members and social workers revealed a pattern of neglect and violence. Cristian had been failed by nearly every adult in his life, from his mother to the system meant to protect him. It was in this context that investigators had to consider, was Cristian solely to blame, or was he another victim of a tragic cycle of abuse? With Cristian's confession on record, prosecutors faced a critical decision. Should this 12-year-old boy be tried as an adult for first-degree murder? The weight of the charge was staggering. If convicted, Cristian could spend the rest of his life in prison without the possibility of parole. Public opinion was deeply divided. Advocacy groups and child psychologists argued that Cristian's actions were the result of years of trauma and neglect. They called for rehabilitation, not punishment, emphasizing that a child's brain is still developing and capable of change. On the other side, prosecutors and critics of leniency stressed the gravity of the crime. David's death was no accident, they argued, and justice demanded accountability. The defense team countered with their own arguments, pointing to Cristian's age and his deeply troubled upbringing. Bianella Susana's actions also came under scrutiny. By delaying medical treatment for David, had she contributed to his death? Questions of culpability and responsibility swirled, further complicating an already heartbreaking case. As the trial date approached, Cristian's case became a symbol of larger societal issues. Could a child truly understand the consequences of such a devastating act? And if not, how should the justice system respond? Cristian Fernandez's court hearings marked the beginning of a controversial and emotionally charged legal battle that would captivate the nation. At just 12 years old, Cristian became the youngest person in Jacksonville's history to be charged with first-degree murder as an adult. His slight frame and youthful appearance stood in stark contrast to the grim charges he faced, creating an unsettling image that underscored the case's complexity. The first court appearance drew intense media attention. Cristian, clad in an oversized orange jumpsuit, sat quietly at the defense table, his eyes often darting nervously around the courtroom. It was a surreal sight. A child, not even a teenager, surrounded by lawyers and officers, staring down a potential lifetime in prison. His mother, Bianella Susana, sat nearby, her expression a mix of grief and apprehension. She, too, faced legal repercussions for her role in the tragedy. Prosecutors began their arguments with a focus on the severity of the crime. They contended that Cristian's actions, while impulsive, demonstrated a degree of intent. The skull fracture that claimed David's life was not, they argued, the result of a simple accident. They painted a picture of a boy who, though young, was capable of understanding the consequences of his actions. The decision to charge him as an adult, they maintained, was not made lightly, but was necessary to ensure justice for David. The defense countered with a narrative steeped in Cristian's tumultuous past. Public defender Matt Shirk and his team portrayed Cristian as a product of his environment, a boy who had never been given a chance to experience a normal childhood. They detailed the years of neglect, abuse, and trauma that had shaped him, arguing that these factors must be considered in determining his culpability. They emphasized that Cristian had acted out of frustration and confusion, not malice, and that he was deeply remorseful for his actions. The legal proceedings took on a new dimension when Cristian's mother, Bianella, was brought into the fold. She was charged with aggravated manslaughter for her failure to seek immediate medical attention for David. Prosecutors argued that her negligence had significantly contributed to her youngest son's death. Her role in the tragedy became a focal point, raising questions about parental responsibility and the cascading effects of poor decisions within a fractured family. As the hearings progressed, expert witnesses were called to testify. Child psychologists and social workers provided insights into Cristian's mental and emotional state. Dr. James Garbarino, a renowned psychologist specializing in child development, described the profound impact of trauma on a developing brain. He explained that Cristian's history of abuse and instability had likely impaired his ability to regulate emotions and assess the consequences of his actions. These testimonies painted a picture of a boy more victim than perpetrator, stirring public sympathy and reigniting debates about the juvenile justice system. The courtroom also heard harrowing accounts from family members and neighbors who described the dysfunction that pervaded Cristian's home life. They spoke of an overwhelmed Bianella struggling to care for her children, often leaving Cristian to shoulder responsibilities far beyond his years. These accounts underscored the systemic failures that had allowed the situation to deteriorate to such a tragic point. Meanwhile, public opinion remained sharply divided. Advocacy groups rallied behind Cristian, calling for rehabilitation rather than incarceration. Petitions circulated, garnering thousands of signatures urging leniency. They argued that sending a child to prison for life was a failure of society to address the root causes of his behavior. On the other side, some community members and legal experts insisted that the gravity of David's death demanded accountability, regardless of Cristian's age. As the trial loomed, the defense team sought a plea deal to spare Cristian the prospect of life without parole. Negotiations were tense, with prosecutors weighing the public's demand for justice against the ethical considerations of trying a child as an adult. In 2013, after prolonged deliberations, a resolution was reached. Cristian pled guilty to manslaughter in exchange for a sentence of juvenile detention until his 19th birthday, followed by probation. The outcome, while offering Cristian a chance at eventual freedom, left many questions unanswered. What kind of life could he hope to build after years in the system? And what measures would be taken to ensure he received the rehabilitation and support he so desperately needed? Bianella Susana also faced the consequences of her actions. In a separate trial, she pled guilty to aggravated manslaughter and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Her case highlighted the cascading failures that had contributed to the tragedy, serving as a somber reminder of the interconnectedness of family, community, and systemic responsibility. As Cristian began his sentence, the focus shifted to his rehabilitation. Educational programs, therapy, and mentoring were prioritized to help him process his trauma and develop the skills needed for a stable future. Reports from juvenile detention indicated that Cristian showed promise, engaging with counselors and making progress in his studies. Yet the weight of his past remained a constant shadow. The legacy of the Fernandez case reverberated far beyond the courtroom. It prompted renewed discussions about juvenile justice, with advocates pushing for reforms to address the unique needs of children in the legal system. Cristian's story became a case study in the complex interplay of trauma, accountability, and the potential for redemption. As Cristian approached the end of his sentence, his supporters remained hopeful that he could rebuild his life. His journey from a childhood marked by unimaginable hardship to the brink of adulthood was a testament to resilience, though tempered by the tragic loss that had set it in motion. For many, the case served as a stark reminder of the importance of early intervention and the need to create systems that protect and nurture vulnerable children, ensuring that no other family would have to endure such heartbreak. Cristian Fernandez's story is a heartbreaking reminder of how a single moment can change lives forever. It challenges us to think about justice, responsibility, and the systems meant to protect children like him. If this story resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more compelling true crime stories. The full interrogation video is linked in the description and will appear in the cue box at the end of this video. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.